My name's Pilita Clark. I'm. Can you hear me? Can everyone up the back hear me? People say they can. Yeah, it's red.
People should go on red. People should go on red, no?
I think so.
She needs the red.
Yeah?
Je pense qu'il y a...
Hello. Testing, 1, 2. Great. Hello, my name's Pilita Clark. I'm a columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, and it is a great pleasure to be here today at the World Trade Organization, the beating heart of a global trade system that is, as we all know, going through some unusually fraught times. Against the rather difficult backdrop of a dispute, a skirmish, an all-out trade war here and there is, of course, a very deep desire to try to find a way to make trade work for the environment. This has proved to be an exceedingly complex and difficult task over the years. Some people believe that free trade is simply incompatible with a sustainable planet. It's impossible, they say, for example, to keep shipping goods around the world at the rate that we have been without heating the atmosphere to unsustainable levels. Others say that trade wars make the environment worse. Earlier this year, the WTO and UN Environment decided to try to work together more closely to see if it was going to be possible to find ways in which trade could contribute to a healthy environment and vice versa. And that's the question that we're going to be discussing here today. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a group of people who are indeed right at the centre of this discussion. A little bit of housekeeping first. This event is being live streamed. For those of you in a tweeting mood, the hashtag is Trade2030, TRADE 2030, or hashtag public forum. And for those who would like to ask questions, we have a site called Slido, SLI.do. If you go to that on your mobile device and then enter the event code TE18. You will then be able to simply type in your question. And I would encourage you to be thinking about questions as the discussion goes on, because my colleagues down in the front are going to be emailing me the list of questions. So those who get in first have a greater chance of having their question asked. If you could also just indicate your name and the organisation you represent, that would be great. There are posters on the walls with this information. So it's sli.do is the site to go to, and you can just type in your question. So, without further ado, let me introduce our excellent panel, starting with Jérôme Pécresse, the Chief Executive of the Renewable Energy Division of General Electric, one of the world's oldest and best-known industrial conglomerates. It also has one of the biggest portfolios of renewable energy in the industry, and previously Mr. Pécresse created the renewable energy business at France's Alstom. To his left we have Isa Maheno, who's a founder of SALT, which is a social enterprise based in the Philippines that uses salt to light people's homes. To her left, Roberto Azevêdo, who needs very little introduction, Director General of the WTO for the last 8 years. He's the sixth person to hold that job, first from Latin America. He has the distinction of being involved in nearly all WTO ministerial conferences in one capacity or another since the launch of the Doha round, which not everybody can say. And to his left, Mr. Erik Solheim, Executive Director of UN Environment. Also, as it happens, the sixth person to hold that job, which he's had since 2016. He's an author, a peace negotiator, and also Under Secretary General at the UN. To his left, we have Mr. Kimmo Tiilikainen, who is Finland's Minister for Environment, Energy and Housing. He's an organic farmer and a forester, and this is his second stint as Environment Minister in Finland, which, as some of you will know, is one of the 12 members of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, which I suspect we will be talking about later. To his left, we have Lucia Wamala, who's the Chief Executive and founder of a Ugandan renewable energy group called Bakulu power. And she was named last year by Forbes as one of the 30 most promising young entrepreneurs in Africa. And finally, we have Bertrand Piccard. Very difficult to know which words to begin with to describe Mr. Piccard, who's an explorer, a doctor, an aviator, a self-described inspireer who 2 years ago showed the world that it was possible to circumnavigate the globe in a plane powered solely by the sun. He is also the chairman of the Solar Impulse Foundation, which aims to find 1,000 solutions that protect the environment in a profitable way. So, let's kick off. Mr. Azevêdo, could you tell us exactly what prompted the WTO to decide to strengthen its cooperation with UN Environment at this particular time?
Well, I would say that it started with the realization that we're not doing enough. Clearly, the WTO has trade very much in its statement of mission. Sustainable development is in chapter 1, page 1 of the WTO founding agreement. So it is one of our main objectives. And I felt that we do work with trade all the day, but I don't think we had a really structured objective. We're dealing now with elimination of or reduction of fishery subsidies that lead to the depletion of marine livestock. We were negotiating an environmental goods agreement, and there were other things. You know, we just set up recently our WTO environmental database. That database is about it compiles almost 20 years of information on trade and environment from WTO notifications that members make to the WTO. And when we do our trade policy reviews, we also touch on environment. So that database touches on all that. And what we found out is that every single year, over 1,000 new notifications of environmental measures are notified to the WTO. So that simply means that 1,000 measures that are related somehow to trade in one way or another. So it's huge. Today, 1 in every 6 notifications to the WTO are related to the environment. And just 20 years ago, it was 1 in 10. That doesn't mean that there is necessarily friction. It just means that the relationship, and this kind of transparency is important, the relationship between trade and environment is absolutely critical. And I don't think we knew enough. And that's why Erik and I met earlier in Davos this year. And we thought, look, we need to explore opportunities, possibilities. What can we do together? And I think that's why the conversation started.
And what's an example of a common notification?
For example, a member will notify, I remember in the case of Brazil, because at the time I was a Brazilian ambassador, we notified to the WTO the fact that retread tires were not being imported to preserve to diminish the number of tires that had to be destined at the end of the cycle, of the life cycle of the tire. Or countries that impose certain types of restrictions on ships that harvest a particular species, but that would not affect, for example, dolphins or turtles or things like that. So they notify those measures to the other WTO members. And I'm giving 2 examples. It's 1,000, so it's many. But all these little measures somehow have a trade-related effect. And members discuss them. Sometimes they don't agree. They think that this is protectionism disguised as an environmental measures. The other side says no. Sometimes there is no disagreement. They all agree, okay, so this is something that we need to do. And others will do the same and learn from that experience. So this is, I think, a very good discussion that we have here.
Okay, so the world has changed. Well, so Mr. Solheim, same question to you. Why did UN Environment decide that it was a good idea to establish this closer working relationship with the WTO?
If you allow me from the beginning to be a little bit personal. I came from a political tradition, green, back home, where there was a lot of skepticism to trade. for some of the reasons Roberto mentioned. I mean, some people saw trade as driving a very unrealistic economic growth, which had a negative environmental impact. But gradually, I came to the view that this is completely wrong. It's factually wrong, because if we do not do trade, we will be much less efficient, which is bad for the environment, and simply we don't get the solution to scale, which is critical for the environment. I mean, just one example. I mean, Prime Minister Modi of India a couple of years back launched a All of India campaign for LED lamps. Well, what happened? The price of LED lamp fell to about 10% of the original price. The difference between making a few thousand of something and 200 million of it. And trade, of course, is the solution to drive this scale of environment solutions. You cannot do that in localized markets because it simply won't be the scale, and price is important. But also I came to the conclusion that it's politically wrong, because I go, as Roberto, a lot around meeting presidents, prime ministers, ministers all over the world, and I try to figure out, have I ever met one president or prime minister who was elected just on an environmental message? Answer is no. I mean, not even President Macron, which is a great environmentalist, or Prime Minister Modi, they're still not elected just on an environmental message. They're elected on a message of, yes, economic development, job creation, uplifting of people, and environment. And if that's the case, we need, in whatever we do, to look for the win-win-win, the triple win solutions. Those who create jobs, those who are good for people's health, and good for the environment at the same time. And then trade is an enormously important tool for that to happen. Look to the African continent. In Africa, there is 1 million young people joining the labor market every month. All of them, like you and me and Roberto and the entire panel, they want a job. They want to feed a family, they want to marry, and it's very hard to marry if you don't have a job. They want to do something meaningful in life, they want income. This is completely normal. The good news is that now we are in a historical phase where it's possible to do this and take care of the environment at the same time. Even more so, going green can provide any number of new, interesting, good, lifelong jobs. So let's look for the triple win solutions.
Okay, well, let's move on to potential solutions then, and let me ask the rest of the panel, from your respective perspectives, if there was one thing that you would like the WTO to be doing that it isn't currently doing, what would that be? And let me start first with Bertrand.
I believe we have to understand first that protection of the environment today is profitable. It is not in opposition to the industry. It is not in opposition to trade, because the technological solutions have become mature. So in terms of production of renewable energy, it's more profitable than gas, oil, and coal. In terms of energy efficiency, it's the market of the century. To replace all the old polluting systems that are inefficient by new modern infrastructures, devices, and systems that can boom the industry, create jobs, and make profit. So I believe this is the first thing to understand. If we adapt the rules of WTO, it will not harm the economy. It will just help the economy to go better. Now, of course, it will go better if the rules allow to get rid of the subsidies on fossil fuels that, including the externalities, come to $5 trillion per year. It's absolutely crazy. And that the rules of WTO can support and give priority to what is clean and efficient. Because these technologies, they need to be better known, they need to come on the market, they need to be implemented, and very often, as we have seen with the Solar Impulse Foundation, they are in startups. They are in research labs, sometimes at big companies also. But all these solutions that are in startups, the startup does not know how to promote them. They don't know how to communicate with it. So in all the governments, if a priority can be given to what is clean compared to what is not clean, then I believe we will be able to pull all these solutions to the market and create a massive added value.
Okay, well, you mentioned fossil fuel subsidy reform. Minister Pilita, I think that's a good moment to ask you if indeed that would be your choice of the one thing that the WTO might be able to be useful in relation to.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Definitely that's one very important issue that WTO could promote, but first I would like to congratulate WTO and UN Environment for this important cooperation, because when we look at from the Finnish point of view, Finland is open economy and we are great supporter of a rule-based international system, free trade and also environmental agreements. And when both of these work together more closely to make world better and to achieve Agenda 2030 targets, we are on behalf of that. So great support for your work. But about the needs that we wish that WTO could do together with UN Environment, this we have discussed a lot of the need putting price on carbon. We need to put price on carbon and make a level playing field for companies doing their business in different corners of the world. And it's strongly against this principle if a great number of countries are still subsidizing fossil fuels. So that's putting negative price on carbon, not price on carbon that could lead the development to the clean technologies and clean solutions. So that's one important issue. But then another item I would like to raise here very briefly, we can continue about this later, is the promotion of circular economy. So it's not only climate change that is threatening the planetary boundaries of globally, it's also the lack of raw materials that is a serious risk for human welfare and economy as well. And circular economy is a solution to this problem.
Perhaps you might just like to define circular economy for us very briefly, because it's not always a term that there's an agreed definition on.
So I would like to say that circular economy is it's like a paradigm shift in our economy. So far, our economy has based in principle that we are exhausting raw materials, then we are producing something, then we are using them, and then we are throwing them away, like a linear tube. It's not sustainable at all. In circular economy, we are looking for solutions that maximize resource efficiency, energy efficiency, and close the material loops. And it's also a very essential part of that is developing business models more based on repairing and remanufacturing than just manufacturing things more and more. This is the idea of circular economy.
Okay, so at the moment, the global economy, the world trade system is based very much on a linear system, and you're saying it should be circular. But how would the WTO framework be able to encourage that, do you think? I mean, what would be the sorts of concrete steps that might be taken?
So the first concrete step is to realize the necessity of this change. This is first step. And I believe, I'm optimist. I believe that if globally we see that some target is very important, we will find solutions. Like we could finally agree on Paris Agreement. We saw that it's necessary to do that. And I guess it's the same with this, when we realize that it's necessary to move towards circular economy, we will find the way. And if I give some examples, about the trade rules. Secondary materials and how we treat waste and secondary materials, or used cars or used clothes and so on. There may be some difficulties for reuse and remanufacturing and these kind of issues. We just need to look through the trade rules with eyes of circular economy.
Yeah. Lucia Wamala, from your point of view in Uganda, perhaps you could explain to us what sorts of trade issues your company is facing and what you think the WTO process may or may not be able to do.
Thank you all for inviting me and including me in this amazing conversation. So a little bit, if I may, tell a little bit about what we do at Bukulu Power. So we are a local Ugandan renewable energy service company. Our core line of business is mini grids, and we also have ancillary services in water purification, sanitation, and clean cooking fuel. So when we look at trade, we kind of look at our work as the precursor to trade, because the Director General could correct me if I'm wrong, but right now Africa accounts for, I think it's 3% of global trade. And a large part of that, well, not the whole part of that, is because of our weak infrastructure. We know that there's hundreds of millions of people without electricity. And at Bukulu Power, we see a difference between access to electricity and development. So our business model, we develop our grids with a productive use element, meaning that we invest in the local economy, in the key economy. For our projects, they're in islands, so we invest in the fishing economy. And we help create jobs, we help create prosperity, and we help these communities and economies get to the level of being able to participate in trade. And it's a very exciting time. We're seeing, there's a lot of talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area. And we like to think that companies like our own are going to be instrumental in seeing a more inclusive trade environment globally, where Africa can play a larger part. And we're going to start to see more value addition, whereas we've been just exporting raw commodities. And for us at Bukulu Power, we think our role is very important because we need electricity for all of those things.
And are there any specific trade barriers at the moment that are affecting your business?
Well, right now, I mean, I don't speak for the government of Uganda, but the government of Uganda does have very good policies for renewable energy. Right now, we don't pay taxes when we're importing renewable energy technology, which is fantastic.
Jérôme Pécresse, I wonder if you could talk about this situation from GE's perspective. GE was a very early backer of the Environmental Goods Agreement, which started off with a bang a few years ago and has been in abeyance for more than a year now. I wonder how it might have affected GE's business and prospects if that agreement were ever to come into being.
And I think, as you know, GE is a very global company and a strong advocate of global free trade everywhere in the world. I think when it comes down to the environment and to renewable, very simply said, free trade is critical to the cost competitiveness of renewable energy, which itself is critical to the planet moving towards the COP21 targets. And if I try to explain very briefly why, I would do it as follows. I mean, one, in renewable, our mission very simply is to drive down the levelized cost of energy of wind and solar. And that's how we can compete with fossil fuel all over the world. The good news is that the industry has done a great job over the last 10 years. If you look at it, solar costs has probably come down by 80–85% over 10 years. Wind electricity cost has come down something like 70%. So we are now at a point where people do new projects out of renewable energy, not because it got good for the planet, not for political reasons. They do it because it's a rational economic decisions to make a new wind power plant or a new solar power plant rather than using coal or gas. And we can compete with fossil fuels in many countries of the world very economically, and we see projects for solar, for wind, being launched every month at $20, $30 per megawatt hour. And we see the trend becoming more and more global. As an example, as GE, last week, we signed our first project for wind in Kazakhstan with Eni, which is a country which has absolutely no ambition in renewables 3 years ago. To do that, we need, and to keep doing it, we need to be able to continue to leverage efficiently our global supply chain, because that's how we cut costs, that's how we can disseminate innovation around the planet. Today, if you take wind blades produced in China, wind generator produced in Vietnam, can end up being assembled in a wind nacelle in Florida for a project in Texas. And this has to continue for us because each step is adding value to the entire process, and the rush towards cheaper and cheaper renewable energy is not going to stop. So very simply said, everything like trade barriers, tariffs, local regulations for mandatory local content are things that are going to hinder our ability to keep pushing down the cost of wind and solar energy and are going to limit the planet's ability to move towards the COP21 targets and reduce global warming.
Mm. I mean, you just talking about COP21, obviously some countries, your own included, in fact France has been leading the charge when it comes to arguing that the EU shouldn't do any trade deals with any country that's not abiding by the terms of the Paris Agreement. The EU is now in the process of negotiating a trade deal with the US, and Mr. Trump has clearly said that he's going to withdraw the US from the Paris Accord. Is it your belief that the EU should ensure that the Paris Agreement underpins this latest trade deal?
I think my belief is that if people are really serious about meeting these COP21 targets, any trade agreements should be designed in a way that make that possible. And again, one thing is the idea that was suggested about promoting CO2-free technology versus others. And the second is make sure that in this agreement, there is no duties or trade barriers that are going to limit equipment for renewable energy to free flow globally.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there is a disconnect at some level.
Okay. Azevêdo, from your perspective, when you look at the components that you have to import for your business, could you tell us how difficult or easy that is, and whether you've thought about any particular goal or any particular aim you'd like the WTO to pursue to make life easier for your business?
First of all, I would like to give you an overview of what we do. We're actually a social enterprise trying to address the light inequality gap in the Philippines by way of a lantern that makes use of seawater, salt water as like a medium for you to generate enough electricity to light up LEDs. I actually brought my lantern here just to show you. So that's enough, like a glass of seawater is enough for you to use for about 4 days straight, even without turning it off. So we're trying to address the light inequality gap because we all know that the Philippines has more than 7,000 islands, and most of these islands are not connected to the power grid. And communities back at home still use kerosene lanterns as their main source of lighting, and we all know that kerosene lanterns are dangerous. It can cause fire accidents and, of course, lung diseases among children. And one thing I would like to point out, I actually wanted to emphasize on the circular economy, because there's this particular, we're in material research, by the way. There's this particular material that we are actually having a hard time getting our hands to. And we found out that if we can do the electronic recycling, you can get this particular material in printed circuit boards. So if we can do something about recycling electronics, if we can focus on that part, I guess we can have sort of some access to that material. And I guess one good thing about the Philippines, I'm from the Philippines, is that we do have a policy regarding importing materials. So if you're under the PEZA zone, PEZA stands for Philippine Economic Zone Authority, they're trying to enable industry, export-oriented industry, manufacturing industry, that if you're part of that, then we can get raw materials. Like we can import them for free. And also, they're very keen and particular on renewable energy. So we're actually having that.
Right. And are you able to get any of your materials at the moment from recycling processes or not?
Yes, the plastic part of the lantern is actually made out of recycled crates.
Crates? What, just packing crates? Or?
Yeah, packing crates.
Okay. That's really interesting, and that's a very interesting example of what Mr. Tilakainen has mentioned in terms of the circular economy. But let me throw it back then to Mr. Azevêdo and Mr. Solheim. So, some interesting ideas there in relation to the circular economy and fossil fuel subsidy reform. Mr. Solheim, perhaps I could start with you. I mean, how do you think, what would be the sort of first step you'd like to see on both of these issues when it comes to trying to introduce them more into the WTO framework?
Reforms of perverse subsidies is an absolute critical issue, and I can just wish Roberto all well on working on that. I mean, why are we feeding the enemy? Why are we subsidizing fossil fuels when we all want a rapid shift into renewables? I mean, it's completely crazy. One of my real favorite nations, a nation I really love, Indonesia, until quite recently spent more money from the public budget subsidizing fossil fuels than they spent on health and education combined. Now, thank God, President Jokowi has reformed the system, so it's much better. But it shows the complete craziness of how you waste money and you waste it on fighting your own purpose. Fisheries is, of course, exactly the same. We see a lot of environmental crimes to the poor people in the world coming from fisheries, and subsidized fisheries is part of it. I'll give you one example. I was in the presidential palace of Liberia, the west coast of Africa, with then President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the one and only female president of Africa at the time. I asked her a very simple question. I said, "What can I do for you?" And she said, "Send me your Coast Guard." And then she pointed right out to in the harbor there, few hundred meters from the presidential palace, any number of shipping vessels stealing the resources of poor Liberians, environmental crime, crime against the poor people, but she had nothing to do, no equipment to stop it, no Coast Guard, no way of stopping it. And we need to reform this. We need to reduce the fossil fuel subsidies, and we need to reduce the perverse fishing subsidies. Good news is, of course, there are also good stories. I mean, North Atlantic, we are doing very well on fishing. I mean, a few decades back, we had huge issues on herring, huge issues on cod. Now the stocks are back in abundance. Why is that? Well, the European Union, Russia, Iceland, Norway came together on a joint way of regulating the fisheries, and of course getting and reducing fossil fuel fishing subsidies. So this is critical for environment, but it's also, of course, a waste of taxpayers' money into what we don't want.
Yeah, and Mr. Azevêdo, from your vast experience in world trade, I mean, perhaps you could talk about why it's been so difficult for fossil fuel subsidy reform to actually enter the agenda, and is it the case that because there's 12 excellent members of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, but that's 12 out of nearly 200 countries, so does it not speak to the need for more countries to be involved, essentially, in this?
Yeah, but the problem is that those subsidies are not there by accident. There are very strong political forces pushing for those subsidies. I will give you one example. We like Erik just said, we're working here in the WTO trying to eliminate or diminish considerably the subsidies that go to fisheries. Fisheries that lead to overfishing, right? Including illegal and unreported fishing that is subsidized by some countries because there are no controls over what the ships are doing in their waters or foreign waters. Now, for us, this is fundamental, and I think that all the participants agree. But some, for example, would claim, well, the subsidies that I grant to my fossil fuel is not for that industry. It is across the board. It applies to everything in my economy. And this is so pervasive, this is so horizontal, that if you try to take it out, it's money to several industries, several sectors that rely on that lower cost, according to their view, to be competitive, to be in a position to compete in the market and outside. So there is a very strong political push behind that. So it's not a clear-cut situation. But I think it's not unmanageable. I think a lot of it has to do with national policies. And one of the things that the WTO must do is not interfere. If there are national policies, which are, of course, consistent with the obligations in the WTO, which are not many, by the way, on this one, there's nothing in the WTO agreements that would preclude a country to undertake policies or grant support or introduce prohibitions on issues that help the environment and that have environmental purposes behind it.
Right, but when it comes to using the WTO to discipline fossil fuel subsidies, I mean, is that really a bit of an ask too far? Is that actually a realistic proposal?
Well, it's up to members. If they agree, it's done.
Yeah,
the WTO will not. That's the point. The WTO does not have the power to impose the discipline or to create the rule. It is the members that have to sit down and say, let's do this. And then they will negotiate, they will talk, and then we'll establish the discipline. Once the discipline is established, it's done.
Yeah.
The problem is the political reality in the countries themselves, which are the ones who are going to be sitting there. Where these people are sitting, this is where they'll be sitting. And some of them will say, it's not doable for me. The political circumstances in my country is not ripe for that. Maybe we can do that with a group of countries that decides we're going to do this, and then they begin to do it in big groups. But then others will say, well, but if I do that and that guy over there doesn't do it, I'm losing competitiveness. He's better off than me. And they don't never take into account the cost of the subsidy, which is another issue as well. But
Right.
that's the reality, the political reality.
Okay, Mr. Tilakainen, I mean, perhaps you could explain why there are actually just 12 of you, and you've been going for a little while by now. Are you trying to recruit, and how have you been going?
Well, actually, this group of fossil fuel subsidy reform countries, we are asking new members to the club. And it's very important what we just heard, that I think that it's all the same if we take the next steps in national policies or WTO. I'm no one to give any advice to some other government, but still I would like to. When we heard that it's a question of national policies, in many countries they are spending a lot of money to push down the price of fossil energy by different kind of subsidies. I think it could be much more responsible or wise to remove that fossil fuel subsidy and spend the same money, for example, subsidizing access to renewable energy, for example, in off-grid areas. So the purpose of keeping these fossil fuel subsidies is mainly somehow trying to reduce the energy costs of ordinary persons. But like we heard here, the situation has changed, and in many corners of the world, renewable energy is more profitable than the fossil one, if the subsidies are removed. So at the moment, it's like, I really much agree with Erik, that it's like feeding the enemy if we are trying to achieve Agenda 2030 goals and Paris Agreement.
Mr. Piccard.
I would like to rebound on what Mr. Azevêdo very correctly said, that WTO cannot intervene into the national policies. But I would like to emphasize that, nevertheless, a fish that is taken illegally in Liberia, or a tree that is cut illegally in a country that makes deforestation, is submitted to the same rules on the international market for trade. And this, I believe, is not normal. This is the moment where WTO could take the responsibility of putting a penalty on the junk trade in order to give the priority to the quality trade. And if WTO was going to do that, it would be an absolutely fantastic message given to the world. It would be the message that WTO is becoming a major actor for survival of humankind. Because today the problems are so big, we just cannot imagine the consequence of what we are facing. The measures in favor of fighting climate change is a slowly climbing line in the straight line. The problems are exponential. So every year the gap is bigger. And we need major actors who take the responsibility of saying stop. So what I find fantastic today in the new relation between UNEP and WTO is that maybe it will give a new actor that will stand up and really do something for the survival of humankind, because this is what is at stake today.
But just to take up Mr. Azevedo's point, it's not as if the WTO can unilaterally impose this. It's the sum of its parts. It's the sum of its members. So, in fact, you really need a lot of large economies to change their minds. And how should that be achieved?
The last time I spoke to a Minister of Energy about giving national priority in all the public procurement to energy efficient products and to clean products and quality products, he told me it's not possible because it would be considered to be a discrimination in the rules of WTO. So even the people who would like to do something are not always able to do it. So this is where I believe WTO can be really useful to the countries who want to give priority to the clean technologies.
Yeah, Mr. Azevêdo, that's a very common complaint that one hears.
And thank you for saying that, because what often happens is that people hide behind the WTO to say they can't do things. It is very common, and I have seen it happen several times when a country says or a government says, oh, I can't do that because that is against the WTO rules. Well, not true. You can do a lot of things. What you cannot do, so for example, we have in Article 20 of the WTO, the GATT, there is a provision that says that nothing in the agreements of the WTO will be construed as prohibiting a country to take measures that will, for example, preserve renewable sources, or the health of animals, plants, and humans, of course, and things like that. There is ample space to do something like that. If you want to do it, you can. The problem is that often what countries do is they, for example, they prohibit the imports of a product that is manufactured in a particular way, which is extremely detrimental to the environment or whatever it is. But they allow it domestically. Now that is the problem. I mean, if you actually are consistent and you say, I will not allow this practice in my territory and I'm not importing it from anybody else, that's a different conversation. I think another country would have a real hard time proving that that's protectionism, because it is a very horizontal, uniform situation. But this is not the norm. Usually, when you see sometimes an environmental measure, it has something in there which does not actually apply in that country. It's just for the imports. And that is where we run into problems. So I wouldn't take statements like that at face value. We really have to go into the details, and there are many ways that you can do things that are perfectly consistent with WTO rules. But like I said, people hide behind the WTO rules to do what they want.
Yes, Minister.
Thank you. I try to be brief. We have seen the same phenomenon not only in international scene but also in national discussion. I have heard so many times when we are discussing about the public procurement in Finland that European Union procurement directive is stopping this and that. That's not true, but actually what we have done in Ministry of Environment, we have made a guidebook for municipalities, how they can set environmental criteria according to the European Union procurement directive to promote environmental friendly public procurement, because it's a very important tool to make the change. So this is not only international level, unfortunately it's also national level. Many times heard that something is protected to prevent something wise thing to be done.
Yeah. But let me ask you, just while we're on criticisms of trade policy in the environmental sphere, this year the EU imposed tariffs on Chinese-made electric bikes, which upset a lot of environmental groups that said that this was really not necessarily the way to go and was only going to result in more expensive forms of low-carbon transport. Yet, I mean, when it comes down to it, although the EU has obviously been a leader in many ways in pushing for environment to be part of the global trade agenda, when it comes down to EU jobs, we see quite a different approach being taken, wouldn't you agree?
Sorry, if someone has something wise to say, please go on.
Well, I suppose it's a broader question about that trade-off.
Yeah, and for example, we see in some new countries opening to wind and solar, instituting some rule for mandatory local production content, which is going ultimately to result in some jobs, but in renewable electricity cost being higher in these countries than it would be otherwise if you could leverage a global supply chain, and hence resulting in lower renewable energy penetration at the end of the day.
Right.
So it's another example that we see flourishing in many countries. Now less than 2 years ago, but this burgeoning of local content rules in renewable energy is ultimately a barrier to renewable energy penetration, because to be effective, we need to leverage global supply chain. But as renewable energy is growing everywhere in the world, people have this paradigm between costs and jobs that they need to solve.
But from the perspective of Uganda or the Philippines, these local content rules in not necessarily the Philippines, but certainly in a lot of African countries are seen as quite important, correct?
Local content rules? Absolutely. For us, we try our best to use as many local products as we can. Local labor force, local technology. But much like Bertrand had said, a lot of the technology companies have a hard time promoting themselves in marketing. So we try our best to use the best things here. Like today we all had a wonderful experience to go and look at some exhibits of some new technology. And as a developer, my company, we procure a lot of equipment. So I'm always very fascinated to see what people are developing, what's ready to go to market. And I'm patriotic Ugandan, so if I can see local technologies, it's great, but I think everyone can agree that we just want to do the best for our communities, for our environment, for our society. So whatever is the best and is cost effective, because we are a for-profit company, we use that.
Yeah. And in the Philippines?
Well, in the Philippine perspective, the economy of the Philippines really run by human resource. So we have a lot of overseas Filipino workers working abroad. So when it comes to like promoting local products, it's just now that we're starting the startup ecosystem in the Philippines is very young. So right now we do have a startup roadmap. It only started around 2015, wherein we're promoting local products and local services. And I think the Philippine government is starting to realize how important the innovation, local innovations, particularly grassroots innovations in the country is, especially when it comes to renewable energy. And of course, also supporting the agricultural sector, because we all know that the Philippines is an agricultural country. So we have a lot of, our government has a lot of programs now, particularly in giving grants into this type of new technologies that are being born in the Philippines. So,
Yeah. I mean, just want to loop back, as it were, to the circular economy question. And I guess I'd like Mr. Azevêdo and Mr. Solheim to talk about what logistically could occur. How could the WTO process, or should the WTO process be changed to encourage a circular economy? I mean, what are the sort of practical steps that would be required?
Well, first of all, I think the circular economy would benefit immensely from new technologies. Recycling and the technologies that would allow for something to be feeding back into the economy. It's still developing. It's not everywhere. It's very sophisticated in some areas. What I would say is the first thing we need to do is to make sure that that kind of technology is available, and that the products that allow for that kind of recycling and that will promote the circular economy is also affordable. Now, one way of doing that is by lowering the costs of all that, and the best way to do that is to reduce tariffs, allow that technology to circulate more freely. And that is something that, for example, was being negotiated under the Environmental Goods Agreement. Right. That was one thing that they were trying to do. Another thing that we believe is very important is that national policy is not hampered by trade laws. So if you want to, for example, develop, and like we were just talking now, Uganda, Philippines, anywhere else, if they want to promote and incentivize the development of new technologies, of new products that are environmentally friendly, etc., that's perfectly okay. And people will say, well, but the WTO does not allow local content. There are two things in investments and in subsidies that the WTO rules, not the WTO, but the WTO rules, which were negotiated among all members, do not allow, is when you provide a subsidy and you introduce a requirement to buy from the local suppliers, or when you introduce a requirement to meet certain export targets. But nothing precludes any country to provide as much subsidy as they want to promote local creation, local innovation, for example. Or, for example, in the Philippines, the salt company, for example, nothing precludes the government from giving her subsidies to produce the lantern. The only thing is there cannot be a target of exports, and there cannot be a requirement that the products that go into the production of the lantern are produced locally. But they can, suppose that she wants to buy the plastic. The plastic is something that is very expensive, and that she wants to buy locally, or the government wants the plastic to be produced locally. Nothing impedes, for example, the government to subsidize the plastic producer. They can subsidize the plastic producer, and the plastic producer will reduce the price and make it affordable. That's absolutely okay. What cannot happen is the government to provide that and make one of those two conditions. You have to meet export targets, or you need to buy from local suppliers. Other than that, You can do pretty much anything.
Well, Mr. Solheim, when you hear that then, I mean, what sort of a role do you see for UN Environment then, considering the latitude that's just been spelt out here? What more would you like to see done?
While, as I said in the opening panel earlier today, I'm a firm believer in global and national regulation to drive environment markets, still let's not forget that technology also is going very, very fast. I mean, let me give you two examples. In Kochi, in southern India, you now find the first 100% solar airport in the world. Everything there is solar. And the guys didn't do it because they were green. They did it because solar energy was the cheapest energy you could purchase in the open market in the state of Kerala. Then they realized, oh, we have something very interesting for the environment. We gave them a prize. They're very proud now. And you may think this is a very small airport. Well, it's bigger than any airport in Africa except for South Africa. So it's not small. It's the fourth biggest international airport in India. 100% solar and 100% done because the price of solar is so low that it's market-based. So technology is incredibly important. Another example, since we discussed fisheries, Google can now trace every single fishing vessel on planet Earth through the satellites and through Google Maps. And not only that, you can see if whatever fishing vessel goes into a conservation area somewhere in the world, you can see how long it's there. And even more incredibly, you can see exactly what fishing equipment it's using. Because through monitoring the movement of the vessel, Google can tell you that's the equipment they use. Because it's a fantastic tool for any government who want to clamp down on illegal, illicit fisheries. There was no tool of that sort in the past. And even more importantly, it's completely open there in the net. So NGOs and others can also look into it. Because maybe in the past, in some cases, a fishing vessel came away with it because they paid someone to get away with it. Well, that's much more difficult if this is completely open for everyone to scrutinize. Greenpeace, WWF, local NGOs, media, everyone. So again, we get new fantastic tools to take us in a greener direction. We need both the regulations and this technology track. On the circular economy, just the most obvious of all examples, which is the electronics markets, but the same with plastics, everything else. If you want this to be successful, we need to start with the design process. If it's just at the end of use, it's good. I mean, it's much better than that you pick up the iPhones and the iPads than throwing them away, maybe in Africa where poor people can be affected by for the health. For sure, much better that you pick them up. But, of course, what we want to get into is the designed electronics where every single component is picked out, recircled, all the minerals are used in new products, don't need so many mines in the world, and where all the plastics, I mean, so full of plastics, a car is full of plastic, where all this is recycled and used as material for new products. Yeah. But for that to happen, we need products to be designed with that aim, and for that again to happen, we need a very, very thorough dialogue between business and governments as to how governments can regulate the markets in the right direction, and business can respond to the customers' desire to have recyclable products.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm aware that you have a plane to catch. We have a question for you in your work as an environmental leader, but also as a peace negotiator. Do you see human rights as compatible with the Sustainable Development Goals and trade?
Absolutely. I mean, let's look into the overriding document we have for human rights. That's the UN Human Rights Declaration from 1946. It starts with right to life. There's no right to life without right to clean water, to a good environment, and then it comes with all the other rights. Sometimes we have a very narrow view of human rights as if it's just a few political rights. Human rights is right to life, right to education, right to health, right not to die from completely curable diseases, which can be cured for $1 a day. You have the right not to die from these, a right to get out of extreme poverty. And then, of course, adding right to free speech, etc., etc. So we need this comprehensive, broad-based view of human rights. And at the end of the day, that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about. To take this perspective of human beings, we need all this. We need food, water, right to speech, right to education. And if you have that perspective of human beings, human rights will be very well taken care of.
Yeah. Bertrand Piccard, we have a question for you from Jürgen Knesch from Greenpeace. Trade rules are demanding technology neutrality. In other words, all forms of energy must be treated in the same way. Do you think we have to change this?
Yes. Of course. We cannot treat the same way technologies that pollute the planet and bring humankind in danger, and technologies that bring solutions, that bring quality of life. In terms of renewable energy, they even bring social stability and peace and wealth to the developing countries. So of course we have to change that, but it is easy to change it because it is now profitable. 5 or 10 years ago, when it was more expensive, it would have been really difficult to change the rule because you cannot impose to have expensive energies if the current energy are cheaper. But today, it starts to be the opposite. Today, you have a lot of poor countries who are getting poorer every day because they spend their currency in buying fossil energy instead of producing local solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, or hydroelectricity. So the technology makes it possible to change the rule. Now, I hope the rules will be changed because at the end, it's human beings who have to change them.
Yeah. But nonetheless, despite the fall in prices and costs of renewable energy, and Mr. Piccard, maybe you'd like to address this, despite that, as long as there are, for example, subsidies for fossil fuels, surely you're still going to need or require, or at least desire, to have something like the Environmental Goods Agreement. Isn't that the case?
I think we are, as you said in your introduction, at GE we are promoter of the Environmental Goods Agreement, and we think it will send a strong signal to the world about the need to go a few steps further. Again, we have moved from a world, as Bertrand was saying, where renewable was dependent on state subsidies, to a world where we are competitive on our own. We just want state subsidies to be lifted for all kinds of fuels, and at the same time, we want free trade to be able to keep transferring cost improvement and innovation across the world. And I think the Environmental Goods Agreement would be a strong signal in that perspective.
Right. But, I mean, Mr. Azevêdo, perhaps you could give the background to why we don't have that agreement, why many years were spent trying to negotiate it, and we still don't have it.
The Environmental Goods Agreement. Yeah, well, because countries change their mind. I wish every country perceived free trade in certain categories of products as a win for everyone. That's not necessarily how it's seen. Also, if you look at the composition of the countries that were negotiating the agreement, not every WTO country was participating. It was just a group of countries. And some wanted to protect this particular product here, but they would like to liberalize another one where they're more competitive. It's always like this. You want to liberalize where you are competitive. You don't want to liberalize where you're not competitive, or where the other side is more competitive than you are. And that's the nature of trade negotiations in general. That's why it's been difficult to negotiate these agreements. In the fisheries subsidies conversation, it's even more striking because there are some countries who say, well, I don't have the means to enforce the disciplines, so I cannot accept the disciplines. And I say, look, we're talking about removing subsidies that allow illegal fishing. Not, improper or over, illegal fishing. So if you don't have that, you should have them. And you should work towards that, in that direction, to have that kind of effort. But of course, in the WTO negotiations, the rules are binding. And if they negotiate that, they will have to implement. Otherwise, they will be subject to questioning and eventually even sanctions on the part of the other countries. So it really has a meaningful outcome, and I think that that's what makes it a bit more challenging. But I would cautious a little bit on accepting, for example, the previous question, like Bertrand just said, we need to change that. Well, we need to change that if the rules actually says that. I don't know that the rule says that. This conversation about technology neutrality is happening in different places. There is no rule at the WTO that mentions anything about fuel. None. What it does have is a provision that says that you are absolutely free to take whatever measures are necessary which are helpful to the environment. Yeah. So there is nothing that says that you cannot differentiate. The problem is how you do that. The problem is how you do it. I remember that one of the early cases in the WTO that I participated, a country adopted a regulation that prohibited the imports of gasoline that contained a certain type of elements because that was very polluting. So, okay, so obviously you have a right to not import that gasoline because it pollutes more than the regular gasoline. The problem was that that country itself produced that gasoline, and that was okay. So it was not okay for the imported gasoline, but it was okay for the locally produced gasoline. That's the kind of, games that sometimes we see being played here. So let's be careful. Again, when people say the WTO rules don't allow this, think twice. Don't buy that statement at face value because often it is not true.
Bertrand, Piccard, I don't know if you'd like to respond to that or...
It gives me an idea. Maybe WTO could publish 10 advisors that governments could use to understand these rules better. Because when I listen to you, it's transparent, it's clear, it's obvious. But the governments very often don't know it. When it's a minister, when even heads of states, they cannot read all the rules that exist. If they had 10 ways that legally could help preventing illegal cut of wood to be important, illegal fisheries, or to give priority to clean technologies and prevent dirty or polluting devices to be imported. If they had that in 10 rules that you could publish, it would be useful for them, and it would be a fantastic sign from WTO that you are participating to this new move.
Seems like a good idea.
Just to complement, I think in the past, I will look and see whether we have something like that. It's always tricky here because they will say, you are interpreting the rule, you cannot interpret the rule. But anyway, I think we have done in the past. We had one report which was precisely on environment, trade and environment, way back, that talked precisely about that. But I will look some more. It's been a while. Because I think that this conversation here is bringing to the fore precisely this, is that a lot of people don't understand what the WTO rules are all about and what kind of space there is to adopt perfectly healthy policies, which some claim are, this is not compatible with the WTO rules, I cannot do this, I cannot do that. So I thank you very much for the proposal, and I'm going to look into that.
I think you do actually publish, or you did publish a year or so ago.
We just did, yeah.
Oh, well, yes, I was going to mention the report, but you've also done, I think, the 10 myths of WTO rules in relation to the environment, which are, but yes, another document you've published today, perhaps you might like to talk about.
Yeah, no, we also published this one. It's about making trade work for the environment, prosperity, and resilience, but I'm not sure that it goes into that aspect of what the rules actually say. So that would complement. But this is a start. I would suggest that those of you who have the opportunity to take a look at it, because it shows above anything, the interrelationship between environment and trade and how trade can contribute to a cleaner environment and a more sustainable environment. But I'm going to look also into this issue of what the rules actually allow and how we can make the case without being without offending members' sensitivities.
We'd never want to do that, obviously. We have time for one more question, I think, and one has come in. We've been talking a lot about tariffs on goods, and we haven't spoken quite as much about services. Questions come in about what impact would the liberalisation of energy services in Africa have on the development of green and affordable energy in the continent? And I guess, Lucia Wamala, that might be one for you.
I think, the conversation about Africa and energy and trade is really exciting right now because, like I'd mentioned earlier, we account for such a small percentage of global trade. So I think the impact it'll have is it's more inclusion. It's more products, it's more value-added products, and it's more inclusion. It's really the short answer.
Yeah. I mean, services it's an interesting area, and perhaps one that others might like to talk about. I mean, the difficulty not just of dealing with tariffs, but, for example, government rules that say that a local contractor has to fix a wind farm if there's any breakdown. In other words, it's difficult. I don't know if that's something that GE has to deal with.
We do service for most of the wind farms we equip. Service, unlike equipment for renewable, is inherently a local game. You do service with local jobs, with a local workshop, with local teams. So I think that for structural reasons will remain a very local game in most countries of the world.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that note, I would like to thank our panel very much. It's been an incredibly enlightening and interesting discussion. I hope you all agree. And perhaps this is an event that we could look forward to having sometime in the future before 2030 to see what sort of progress may or may not have been made. So please join me in thanking our panel very much. Did you manage to change it? No.